Welcome to another episode of A Come Together. Okay, we are live. Thanks, Doctor, for coming. Appreciate it. I try not to make this too formal with when it starts, when the recording starts, but there's always a tangible shift in the air when the mic goes live. So you wanna thank you so much for the time. Thanks for agreeing to meet with me. Can you tell me just a little bit about who you are and a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. So I'm Ryan Wagoner. I am in Tampa, Florida. I wear a number of different hats in my professional career, but I think my central title is the chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at the University of South Florida.
What does that generally look like day to day to be a chair of a department?
Well, I mean, the chaos of keeping a whole lot of different mission areas together is really the day to day, right? So it's not the same job each day. Really, I think if I was to boil it down, it's to make sure that I'm facilitating everybody here in the department in terms of being able to meet their goals, be it education goals, be it clinical goals like treating patients or research, trying to find the next cutting edge thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much of an administrative role where
Sure.
it's making sure those people have the right resources, the right amount of time, and I like to joke that I like to help smart people be smart,
Mm-hmm.
and give them the opportunity to focus on that. And we're often successful at that, but it's also a role where when problems come up, you have to find solutions to them.
Sure.
It's not something where you can say, well, that's somebody else's problem. Often, the buck stops at you.
Yeah.
So if I were to encapsulate it, I would say facilitator and problem solver. I mean, those are my two big ones.
So a big chunk of your day is putting out fires.
Depends on the day. Depends on the day. So, and depending on what project that we're working on, I think that there's always a component of that. And what I've found in leadership a lot of times is that there are always fires. And if you ever think that there's not, then something is probably going terribly wrong. You just don't know about it.
There's miscommunication.
And, I'll use the term fires all the time because I like that. But I also don't like to imply that that means that it's bad
Sure.
on a day-to-day basis. It just means that there are problems that need solution,
Right.
Which I find is most of life, even if you aren't in a leadership role.
Yeah, definitely. Is there a very heavy bureaucracy to navigate typically, or do you have a lot of freedom to kind of resolve issues at your own discrepancy?
So it's an interesting question. I think that you can find bureaucracy when you want to, because a lot of people will chafe at any sort of oversight. And one of the things that I had to learn very early on was that you work within the system that you're in, and there's usually a reason for
Right.
there being some sort of oversight or as you would say, bureaucracy. And yeah, some of it is a little bit cumbersome that you have to navigate. But that's also because a lot of times you're dealing with very large organizations that have lots of people with different needs. And so it's hard to find a cookie cutter solution to everything. So, what I usually try to emphasize is, yes, there are things that you may not necessarily agree with in terms of navigating it, but focus more on navigating it.
Right.
If you get yourself into the rut where a lot of people do, which is where they say, well, I don't like this. I don't like the bureaucracy. I don't like the oversight. I don't like that I have to do these extra tasks. That's all well and good, but you haven't changed anything, and you're really not navigating it well.
Yeah.
Because, just grumbling about things usually doesn't help to advance the needle at all.
Sure. It's funny because so what I do other than this is I sell medical equipment. I work with my dad. He started a company when I was 4 or 5 years old. He used to be a pharmaceutical rep, and then and then one day they got in an autoclave machine, and the guy that they bought the machine from had left his sticker. His name is Dom, Italian guy from New York, and they left a sticker. They left a sticker on on the machine. And my dad called the guy, and he goes, "Hey Dom, my name's Ash. I'm looking. I'm just curious, about this autoclave machine." And he says, "Okay, are you a dealer?" And my dad said, "Sure." He goes, "Yeah, I'm a dealer. I'm looking to sell this." And he goes, "Okay, it's $1,500, whatever it was, right?" And my dad asked, my dad hangs up the phone and he asked the guy that he was working for, how much you guys pay for this? And it was like 4 or 5 grand or something like that. And my dad was like, that is a great margin,
Yeah.
like that's awesome. So he actually kept in touch with the guy and he kept on doing it. And he kept on hustling until he started his own business. And one of the things, the consequences, I think, is my dad's one of these kind of personalities. And I'm also, I think, not quite to that extreme, but he does not like answering to people. And he likes to have those, he likes to come to his own resolutions his own way, and he likes to deal with problems. He likes to be the guy to deal with the problems, you know. And I've noticed, and I used to feel the same way. Just looking up to him when I was growing up, and I swore my whole life I'd never work with him. And the second I graduated college with a creative writing and literature degree, there weren't too many other paths for me to go down. So I started working with him, and I started picking up a little bit about the business and a little bit about dealing with customers and I've noticed that there was a massive, like, where he wouldn't work with, within, I guess, those steps or the bureaucracy, there was a massive hole in the business and in the way that the business operated, and even in potential customers, right? So, for example, we did business with University of Miami, right? And University of Miami sends us a whole onboarding list of things that we need to be as vendors. And my dad hadn't done business with them before. We weren't registered as business, as their vendors. And I get this whole sheet of documents to get me signed up as a vendor. And I look at, I have no idea what to do, and I'm immediately flustered. I'm immediately overwhelmed. And and I started just going through them slowly, just one thing at a time. Like, oh, this is not bad at all. Like, this is just a bunch of documents that all kind of are asking for pretty similar things every single page. And, there might be a discrepancy here or there, but, I've really found that there, I used to think that all bureaucracies were kind of just slow, bad, useless. And then when I kind of got thrown into the opposite end of the spectrum, into the jungle, so to speak, I found that that was not really very safe either. And there's a lot of missed opportunities and really miscommunication. And the one thing we still deal with is, who deals with what problem, who deals with what customer. If I sell an ultrasound machine to a customer, it stops working and the customer calls me, I call my dad. I call my dad. Say, hey, this machine's not working. Okay, I'll deal with it. I don't hear back from anyone for 2 weeks. Customer calls me back. It's been 2 weeks. I don't have an answer. Like, but I thought that we were all communicating. Nope, sorry, it's not happening. So
No, it's impressive that you found that with filling out things like paperwork, and that's a wonderful example of where you sort of have a choice where you can choose that you're going to rage about it, right?
hmm
And many people do. I don't like this. This form is dumb. I don't know why I have to do this, that sort of thing. And you know what? Sometimes you need that in order to affect change. So if you say, hey, do we really need to do
yeah,
this form? You can do that, and I don't want to diminish that at all. But on the other hand of things, it's actually pretty fast, as you found, to figure out how to actually
sure,
complete it in a way that you can get efficient with it so that you can complete that and go move on to what it is that you want to do. The other thing I think was interesting as you said it, and I hear this a lot from particularly trainees
mm
who are kind of going through either medical students or residents or fellows. They'll say that thing where I don't ever want to have a boss, right? And unfortunately, I have to tell them everyone has a boss,
yeah,
and it doesn't matter what you do.
sure,
If you think that you're the CEO of some huge company, guess what? The shareholders,
are
if
the
you're
boss.
a public company, are going to be your boss, or the board over top of it. Even if you go out and you open your own business, you identified who your boss is. It's customers.
Yes, that's
Customers are your boss. For politicians, it's voters. There's always another level. And what's really interesting is how it kind of comes around full circle, where, you might think to yourself, well, the customer who buys my product, who is not spending a lot of money, that person is at a, quote unquote, lower tier job.
hmm
Well, in reality, at a certain point, the company answers to them,
yeah,
right? Because if they don't make a product that that person wants and, fits that need, you're going to go out of business.
yeah.
So, to me, a boss is anybody that dictates what it is that you do on a regular basis. If they can run you out of business, that's your boss.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I learned that. I came to that realization not within, I don't think with the same in as many words, but I came to that realization pretty quickly, where I have and their customers actually were, I know that once we take their money, that they're the boss. And they're customers that I can tell when we start talking, and I'll be like, I don't want you to be my boss for this deal. Like, I would rather find another customer. Like, they call me and they give me a hard time about this and that and shipping costs and who's paying for what and what percent discount could they get, and they get the machine and there's a nick on the handle of the machine and they want a full refund, or and I go, I don't want you. I'd rather find a customer that, I'd rather find a boss that I can work with. I'd rather find a boss that I can deal with. And so a lot of times, even before we even do the deal, I'll be like, I actually think, listen, I have this machine available. I think that, I could give you a referral. I can tell you that, I really think that that there's another company that might be better suited to be able to help. And I have a couple of buddies that just being in the industry for 10 years now, that, that I already know can, will probably be, a better resource for them. And it ends up building, favors and community and, and friendships along the way. If there's a machine that I don't service and I give it to a buddy and I give the customer to a buddy of mine, then that guy's happy as could be. He's more likely to reciprocate. Everyone's happy. Everyone feels good. And I don't get that boss that that I can't stand.
Yeah, I mean, you're creating the environment where you thrive,
Yeah,
right? I mean, that's what you're doing. And so you're doing that by making sure that the people that you're answering to are the people that you want to answer to.
certainly.
And to me, that's where you get a lot of job satisfaction. I love being able to say that I absolutely love my boss. I think that that's a critical part of being able to really start crafting that environment where you work really well. If you say, well, I absolutely hate my boss, my question then becomes, well, why are you working there? And
Right.
and a lot of people don't have a choice,
Right.
right? And so that's unfortunate. But if you do have the choice, I think knowing who it is that you answer to can, and respecting that person and feeling that vision or that goal, that really helps.
Yeah.
And so if that, as you say, if the person that you're answering to is going to be the customer, and it's a customer that you're like, your values are completely different
Yes.
than mine. I don't necessarily want to be a part of that. That's important then that you don't have that customer.
Sure. 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 Yeah, I literally was just thinking of something that I just lost my train of thought. But yeah, I completely agree. That's actually part of the reason why I've been building up this podcast, is for the same reason, because these conversations with, it's a phenomenal learning experience. My boss is whoever I'm interviewing and dealing with, and so far it's been awesome, and I've, over 100 episodes out, and with over 45 different guests of those 100 people. And actually, it's pretty crazy. Almost, I don't think any of them, maybe one or two of them, do the same thing in terms of their profession, which is really, really cool. So it's not like I'm talking to 40 different accountants all doing this, different types of accounting. I'm talking to, if it's a doctor, one doctor might be a chiropractor, one might be a psychologist, one might be a family medicine practice, maybe in family medicine. If I'm talking to, a pilot, like there's so many great opportunities out there for people to really, and it's a great storytelling message, which is also something that I've always been very passionate about. How did you get involved with the university? Was that when you got involved with USF? That was that in a clinical setting, or were you a professor, or what happened there?
Yeah, so whenever I finished up my fellowship training, so my subspecialty is actually in forensic psychiatry.
Okay.
And whenever I finished up with that, like many people, I wanted to know what kind of doctor did I want to be? And I didn't just mean the specialty, but did I want to work at a private hospital? Did I want to work, outpatient? What was it? And I was kind of open to a lot of options. I came back to the Southeast. I was in California before, and I came back and I was actually working in Georgia.
How'd you like California?
Loved California.
Where were you?
Sacramento.
Nice.
So it was a nice advantage to be right there next to Napa.
Mm-hmm.
Have a short little drive over to San Francisco.
Sure.
Fell in love with Carmel and Yosemite and all of those.
Sure.
I think our biggest impetus was we wanted to be closer to family. And I'm actually a Florida native, so getting back into this region was sort of our goal. And so I came back to Georgia and was working at a private hospital for a little while, just because that was what was available at the time, and found that there were a couple things that I missed. One of them was really that academic component. That
You liked that. You enjoyed it.
and it's funny because sometimes you don't realize how much you enjoy it until you're not in it for a
Uh-huh.
brief period. What I missed was that I could have some of the smartest people I've ever met around me that I could go ask advice from,
Sure.
right? Or to just have a conversation with, bounce things off of. I also miss the teaching a lot.
You taught.
So I found that I've enjoyed teaching for most of my medical training, and didn't really realize how much of a component that was for me until I didn't do it for a bit.
So I'm sorry, can you just rewind a little bit
Sure.
so you're in med school. When do you get an opportunity to start teaching? How does that happen?
So you can, some people will actually start teaching in medical school. That's a little bit more rare, but really that
Teaching
first.
medical students.
Right. Well, teaching others, undergrads,
Oh,
that
okay,
sort of
gotcha.
thing.
Okay.
Usually, sometimes you can teach your peers, and sometimes it's teaching somebody that's just a level below you. And
Hmm.
so, really, where I started to cut my teeth most with teaching was as a resident.
Gotcha.
I was a resident. I was interested in psychiatry. I was very interested in forensic psychiatry. The intersection between psychiatry and the law. And we didn't have many lectures that looked at things like, what is it like to work with attorneys, or what is malingering? And oh my gosh,
What is
somebody
that?
somebody might lie to you in a court. So
Oh,
malingering is the intentional production of false or grossly exaggerated symptoms, usually applied to something like either a legal setting or to
I gotcha. So if
hallucination.
someone does something and you plead insanity, and like just because they've been in a bad mood recently, and so you over exaggerate their whatever the case is.
Right. And so these are things that we don't often talk about, but it became a real interest for me. And so I started to teach while I was a resident, and medical students enjoyed it. And
Yeah.
so we kind of kept that up. And then I continued to do that whenever I went to fellowship training.
Did you get to pick your own coursework? How'd you do that?
Yeah, so it's when you express an interest and you're willing to go do something for free, people love
I bet.
people love
I
you to do
bet.
that,
I
right?
bet.
And so for me, it was just being able to impart that knowledge on others because I found it so fascinating.
So what were you teaching? What were the courses about?
The main one that I taught during residency was on malingering.
Cool.
It was on that ability to detect people who are, either feigning symptoms or exaggerating symptoms and what that looked like. Interestingly, at the time you think, wow, I've learned this, and now I can impart it on others. I know all about
Yeah.
this. I've still spent the rest of my career learning how to detect malingering effectively,
Right.
which I think is probably a good thing. But that was really where I got my initial interest in teaching, was being able to teach this smaller subsection of psychiatry to people who also had an interest in the area, but maybe didn't even know that existed as a
Hmm.
subspecialty.
Hmm. Wow. I'm sorry. I'm responding strongly because I'm rereading a book right now called Chaos, about Charlie Manson,
Mhm.
and and one of the big questions that constantly being asked about him is, was he crazy? Was he not? Was he taking all the LSD and drugs that he was giving the other family members, or like he was such an enigma, and he seemed so crazy at some points, and at some points he seemed so intelligent and rational rather, and it just like it's so funny that you're talking about that now, because I'm so curious what if I don't know if it was big in in the late '60s or early '70s, the concept of malingering.
Yeah.
That but how useful it may have been to have something like that around for criminals like that, or cult leaders and stuff.
Yeah, it's not anything that's brand new, but it's definitely something that's picked up more and more as there's been more formal training in that area. Forensic psychiatry as a subspecialty has been around for a little while, but not nearly as formalized as it has been over the past couple of decades. I mean, we had an explosion of fellowship training programs to start being able to train people to actually look into these
Uh
things.
huh.
Because, there's assumptions that people make all the time that psychiatrists are able to do, but without formal training it becomes very difficult.
Sure.
For example, detecting malingering.
Yeah.
You know, Another one is violence risk assessment. People assume that most psychiatrists automatically know how to assess somebody's risk, when in reality, that's not a huge part of a lot of their curriculum. And
Right.
so, on the malingering side of things, there's a lot of misconceptions there too. I've seen that folks have before said things like they're lie detectors or human lie detectors, or they can tell somebody's
Sure.
lying, or they can read minds and those sorts of things, which there's no evidence to back that up,
Right.
right? I mean, nobody's any better than others. I mean, there's some small sub-studies that maybe that there was a statistically significant difference for this one group in a very, very controlled environment. But for the most part, if you were to tell me that, like, you rode here on a purple cow, I, I can probably disbelieve it because it's unlikely, but I can't say for certain, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not.
There's a term for that where you can't disprove it, but you can't but it does not it doesn't really like there's a purple dragon, there's an invisible purple dragon in the room with us right now.
Right.
And you can't say that it's not true, but like there's no evidence that supports it either. I forgot what the term is.
Now, and if you get really, a little less crazy about just the terminology and things, if we said, for example, if you told me that you drove here in a Ford today,
Mhm.
versus any other type of car, I'm not going to be able to tell you
Sure.
if we could or not. I mean, what malingering is interesting about is it's all about the ability of somebody to know psychiatric conditions and mental illness better than the other person does, right? So, whenever I assess somebody for malingering, I'm not looking for, can I read your mind? Can I get your thoughts? It's more of, is what you're telling me consistent with the literature or what we
Right.
typically see in mental illness? Or is this so far outside of the bounds that it makes no sense,
Sure.
right? So, I'll get asked every once in a while on a stand, so are you saying that you can detect lying? And the answer is no. I can show you where the inconsistencies are with
Yes.
somebody's
It's
self-report.
kind of law.
It kind of is a little bit. But at the end of the day, I'm still not able to do any of those parlor tricks that some folks might throw out there where they say, well, let me close my eyes and read your mind. Doesn't happen.
So the study of malingering is more about being more educated and finding flaws in the defense, I guess, or whatever the person's saying. I guess I was listening to a podcast the other day on the Sean Ryan show. I don't know if you ever listened to it, but one of the guys that was on was this former drug addict, and he was apparently a brilliant kid and person. He is apparently, but he said he just shot his brain cells because of all the drugs he did. And one of the things that he said, one of the ways he was able to get drugs at such a young age was his father was a doctor, and he used to, when he was bored, when he was like 11 or 12, read a lot of his literature.
Mm-hmm.
And then whenever he got in trouble, he'd get sent to a therapist or sent to a psychiatrist, and he would verbatim describe bipolar disorder and then get the whatever amount of drugs that they would give him, even though he wasn't experiencing what he was describing. And so I guess he was out malingering the doctor. I guess he was he knew the literature well enough to be able to make his case for himself that he wanted that.
Well, one of the most effective groups that can malinger symptoms are people with true mental illness, right? Because if you actually know what it looks like, then you could feign or exaggerate those particular symptoms,
Right.
right? And it's a tough balance, right? Because it really depends on the context. So, if we're treating somebody who's a patient, I'm often really not trying to put up my radar for malingering, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that person is coming, you want to help them. Your
Yeah.
first interest is to make sure that, they do better. And so part of the calculus of that is typically not like, I'm going to suspect that they're feigning or exaggerating. However, depends on the legal context. So if somebody, for example, is pleading insanity in a case, then that's a great time to start looking for malingering because the
Right.
person has a really good incentive to feign or exaggerate symptoms.
Do you ever advise on on legal cases?
I do.
You do?
I mean, I would say probably a good chunk of my time still is spent either evaluating cases or consulting with attorneys.
How'd you get started in that? Like, how do you go about becoming the doctor on call for that?
So, it is a subspecialty, actually. So you can do a fellowship in it. So if you decide that you want to go into psychiatry, you can do a fellowship after your general training in forensic psychiatry.
Wow.
And so I knew fairly early on that I wanted to do that. As soon as I figured out I wanted to be a psychiatrist, I knew I wanted to be a forensic psychiatrist. And luckily, there were a number of different avenues to get educated on that. One was through fellowship. Two was through, there's a national organization for it called the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, and started going to their conferences and
Wow.
started getting really into learning from some of the folks who were on the cutting edge of this, some of the luminaries in the field who had been the first ones writing about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, once you learn to do it and you do it, then you practice it, right?
How important are these conferences?
How important?
Yeah.
I think huge. It's like a textbook,
Right.
right? A textbook comes out, and there's always that joke that it's out of date the moment that it comes out
Sure.
because information is evolving and progressing, and sometimes you want to get the most up to date literature, but you want it in a presentation format, or you want somebody to tell you what does that mean
Sure.
and what's the nuance of that. I also find that conferences, if they're done right, they give you a couple of other things. One is that they give you hands-on exposure through things like workshops and follow along with us and things. But the other is building those relationships
I
with
was going to
people.
ask.
I Some of my favorite colleagues I've met at conferences, and we've hit it off, and we've continued to stay in touch for years. And then you continue to go to conferences, and it's like a reunion every year,
Sure.
right? You go back and you see the same people, get to talk about where are you at with your careers, bounce things off of each other, but also learn from each other. I mean, the number of times that I'm sitting across a table having a beer with somebody at a conference, and we start going off on some very minute academic piece of data. It happens all the time, and then but it's great because you get to really get granular with something,
Sure.
and with somebody that you trust in their opinion, and that often there's enough trust that you can argue about it,
Sure.
which is great because
Beautiful.
to me that's how science works, right? We all get together, we try to come to a consensus, but then we hash out all the things that are inconsistent.
Sure.
And so I think conferences are wonderful for that. The other thing is that you can get really involved in trying to shape education at a national level with those. So, for example, I've held a number of different roles in that organization, and it allows me to make some broader changes, either to guidelines that we're publishing for certain types of evaluations, or how we teach things differently, and a lot of different stuff. So, I found, at least for me, academically, conferences have been a huge part of my career.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, like, again, as I'm diving into this, I have different series on the podcast based on what my interests are. So there's health series, psychology series, history series, sports series, entertainment. In each of these series, I'm kind of limited in obviously my exposure pool, and I go about I spend a bunch of my week, maybe 20, 25 hours a week, researching people and and reaching out to people to introduce myself and talk to them. And part of me wonders whether or not going to these conferences in different industries for the sake of making those relationships and kind of being on top of what's happening in the industry is worthwhile. And I was a little nervous because I think that COVID kind of squashed the embodied experience that a lot of people used to really love. And even though, I know even for example that with a lot of corporate jobs, people are slowly starting to get back to the office, but corporate dinners aren't as big of a thing. And going out as a team to get drinks, once a week or once every other week is not really as much of a thing anymore. And everyone kind of is buckling up. I wasn't sure how much of a difference it would make. Have you noticed in the last couple of years that these have been ticking up?
So I actually we're right in the middle of planning the conference for that organization in October in Boston, and so I've seen a lot of changes since COVID. I do think people want to get together still. I think that there's a desire for that. I think it is modified to a certain extent
It is.
because people have to have some value or some reason to get together and that sort of thing. And I think people are keeping an eye on that a little bit more. Before it was just, oh, it's expected that once a year you're going to go all meet in this particular city. Now people demand, well, if I'm going to make that travel,
It's got to be worth it.
it's got to be worth it, right? Because instead I could just do it online or something like that. Where I interestingly have found it is that it's getting harder to do conferences. And a lot of it is a financial reason.
Yeah, sure.
After COVID, particularly hotels, they had to start recouping some
Mm-hmm.
of that money, and so they had to raise prices.
Sure.
And so suddenly the price of a conference has gone through the roof dramatically. And part of that is because of after effects of COVID. Now, is that going to come back down because COVID's gone? Probably not, right?
Yeah.
The hotels are kind of used to it, and this is the new model that we live in. But it does make it a little bit more difficult in organizations because then what do you do? Do you raise dues? Do you raise the registration?
Yeah. And then what do you lose by doing that?
Right,
And who do
and
you lose by doing that?
and that's something that we've struggled with as well as an organization is what's the most effective way to make sure that we are still able to break even and pay for what we need to, so that we can be solvent, so that we can be here for the members in 5 to 10 years. But at the same time, not put as much pressure on people who are already considering, should I go to a conference or not.
Yeah.
And so I think, what you see a lot more with conferences, I think there are still in-person ones, and I think that they still have a lot of value, but I think that they have to broadcast what that value is.
Yes.
And I think that they have to be cognizant of what the costs are. I mean, it's kind of like everything in life. You look at the risk versus benefit, but I think it's become more pointed where, if you want to go to a conference, you got to have a good reason to.
Hmm. Yeah, I found, I'm curious if it's the same way at conferences, but I found one of the things that I enjoy about craft beer, cigars, live music, is that when you go to these kind of places, I think that, and maybe I'm sure you've noticed this in your profession, that social anxiety is at a pretty, it feels very, very high right now, and that people are less and less inclined to just communicate with strangers. Everyone kind of looks at other adults and other people like a threat more than they look at people like they are, hey, you're just another person like me. And that's why I find enormous relief if I go to a brewery. Everyone's in that brewery because they like craft beer. So you already have that thing in common where you could say, hey, what are you drinking? What is that the style you like? Have you been to another brewery? And you're not expecting the other person to look at you like you have eight heads on your, 8 heads on your shoulders, because that's what we're here for, and we'll all enjoy it. Do
Right.
conferences have that kind of camaraderie like that, you think?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you don't go there unless you're interested in that particular topic.
And then people are willing to just engage with strangers and
And it depends on the conference and how open and inviting it is.
right.
I remember the first time that I went to an AAPL conference, which is the acronym for that. It gets confusing as all get out when you tell people you're going to the Apple conference, and they think that you're going to go see the new iPhone. But I remember one of the first ones I ever went to. There was somebody who was a psychiatrist who had evaluated some very high-profile case in the past. And I remember, being very nervous and thinking, I'm just going to walk up and ask this person a question. And, you're like, well, what's that reaction going to be like? I mean, this
Yeah.
person's kind of a celebrity in that area. How are they going to respond? It was very inviting. It was,
Hmm.
oh, let me love to talk to you about that. Sure, I'd love to describe that further. And it inspired me to continue to be in that organization.
Awesome.
The important thing is that if you ever have that experience and then you ever get to move your way up in the field, be that person,
Yes.
right? Don't be the one when somebody comes up to you then and says, "Oh, I've read X, Y, and Z that you've written, or I saw your presentation. I absolutely love it." Don't grumble at them and try to brush them off and things. You want to remember that there's that same desire for connection
Hmm.
that people coming into it want, and it's I don't know if that's the case across all organizations. But those are the organizations I'd
Sure.
like to be part of.
Sure.
And I
Beautiful.
think those are the ones that are successful. So I do think that if you find the right one that has a similar interest to you, you're right that can lower the anxiety a lot, because A, you know that you're not going to be rejected, but B, you already have something to talk about,
Yes.
right? Because it is difficult when you walk into a room knowing nothing about the person in advance, knowing what to talk about,
Hmm.
right? Because you feel a sense of worry and embarrassment, and am I going to say the wrong thing, and
Hmm.
that sort of stuff. It takes a little bit of that away.
Yeah.
If you walk into a forensic conference and you're there to talk about forensics, you're probably going to find a
Yeah.
couple other people that want to talk about that.
Sure.
So there's something comforting about that.
Definitely. Definitely. So, okay, it was good to hash that out.
No,
So,
no. And I guess I'll bring it back, because
yes.
the moment that forensic psychiatry comes up, always, by the way, we get derailed, because everybody finds this huge interest in it and that sort of thing. So I'm not surprised that we chatted about it, because people love to hear about that. It
Sure.
seems to be something that the public has an interest in now, and I don't know if it's all the true crime podcasts and all
It's a
that
lot
kind
of
of stuff.
that.
It probably is. It
I
probably
mean,
is.
Netflix has been just putting out true crime after true crime after true crime.
But we were talking about how to get back into academics, and I
Yes,
think that's where we kind of,
that's right, that's right. That's I was gonna bring that back there. Right.
no,
Yeah.
no, no.
So you got it. So how you got it? So you were teaching was
So I was teaching a little bit during fellowship, and I
in
was teaching during
California.
residency. Yes, and I knew that I had an interest in presenting at conferences. I love presenting at that national conference that we talk about. Um, and then I decided that I was going to take a little bit of a segue. I was going to try out what it was like to be outside of that academic environment. Did a little bit of teaching still. I had a volunteer faculty appointment at a local university in Georgia, and but my focus was almost exclusively seeing patients, doing clinical work, and I missed it. I missed teaching. Um, you find out sometimes you find out who you are based upon what you're not doing.
Hmm.
And for me, whenever I wasn't teaching nearly as much, I really just missed that interaction, the the ability to challenge learners, to challenge myself, right? Because if you're going to teach it, you better know it,
Hmm.
or when you start getting asked questions, you're just gonna be awful at answering those. So I started to look back into it, and what was really fascinating was there. We were looking at jobs in Florida because native Floridian,
Probably
and
one of the few nowadays.
I know.
It's
Well,
crazy.
more and more though, more and more nowadays. Um, but we looked. The University of South Florida had put out an ad, and it was fairly nondescript. It was, we're looking for psychiatrists. And so I came down and I interviewed, and I remember very distinctly that there was an interim chair at the time, who is wonderful. She was one of the nicest, most knowledgeable people I've ever met, and she and I had a really great conversation. And she said, "What do you want to do here?" And I said, "Well, you know, and at the time, I have to say that I was probably a bit more guns blazing, like I'm going to take my chance always, that sort of thing." And I thought to myself, I could just say, I'm looking for whatever it is that you need, or I could say exactly what it was that I wanted. And I chose the latter for better or worse. And I said, look, I absolutely love forensic psychiatry. This is what I wanted to do. I noticed that you don't have a fellowship. I'd love to start a fellowship here,
Beautiful.
because they hadn't had a fellowship here in probably, I want to say at that time it was 5 or 10 years or something like that. And I said, "Is there interest in that?" And her response was, "Do you think that you could get it started in the next 3 years?" And I said, I think with the right resources, I can.
Is 3 years a reasonable timeline? What's that look like?
I think so. I think so because you obviously need to get your feet wet with the environment itself, figure out what all the resources are that you're going to have. You're going to have to start something. You're going to have to go through all of the accreditation process. So,
Is that daunting? How do you deal with that?
well, you don't know how daunting it is until you start doing it.
I know it
Honestly,
doesn't make you want to quit. Like
I,
one of
I
my biggest problems is that I get overwhelmed with these long processes, and it makes you just want to think, forget about it. I'll do something else. You know?
and what I have found in life is that if you start it, that's when you'll learn it.
Hmm.
A lot of the time,
Yeah.
you can get yourself ready for it, but you're not ready until you're actually enmeshed into it.
Right.
The day that I finally opened that 100-page plus application that is for a training program, I'm going to admit it's overwhelming for a
Hmm.
moment there, and sometimes more than a moment. But what you have to do is just start working through it.
Yeah.
And as you do, you start to realize, oh, well, the reason that they're asking this question is because they want me to develop this particular thing that meets the requirement, and I need to think through that, and I need to think through this, and I need to think through this, and so it actually has a purpose behind it.
Hmm.
And so I came on here. I left my job in Georgia and came down here, basically to start a forensic fellowship. There was other things, uh, doing patient care, doing some education for the general residents, those sorts of things. But that was a reason
Right.
that I came. That, and because I really enjoyed the people, right? There seemed to be a great department here that was looking to grow, and it was a good opportunity.
Mm.
I really respected the leadership here at the university. I thought this is going to be a good place. And hey, by the way, it doesn't hurt at all that my mother-in-law is, only a short distance away,
Oh
so my
yeah.
wife is going to be happy.
Beautiful.
Um, and
How far is she from here?
Not too terribly far. I think it's like from here probably a 30-minute drive,
Oh, perfect.
something like that. So
Nice. Yeah.
it's definitely not too far. At the time, I can't remember if she was there or if she was somewhere else, but it was within this same
Sure.
region.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the stars sort of aligned for
Awesome.
us. I remember coming home to my wife, and she had thought, well, we were just kind of poking around and stuff, and I said, I really think I want to come here, and she was just so happy, because she obviously wanted to be closer to family, and if this was going to work out, let's
Yeah.
give it a try.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's how I got back into academics after a very short kind of segue outside of it.
When you missed it, you were just coming home. First of all, do you have do you feel one thing? My grandfather was a gastroenterologist,
Mhm.
and one of the things that he was lamenting. I mean, he's probably in his mid 80s now. He retired about 10 years ago. And one of the things he was lamenting towards the end of his career was that he didn't have as much, like, he loved having a relationship with his patients where he felt like he could also teach them. He felt like he was an educator, right? Like,
Yeah.
they'd call him and he would explain to them what was going on and what they should avoid and what they should stick to, and talk them through what's happening to their body as as they need it. And sometimes it was for a day, sometimes it was for 5 years, sometimes it was for a lifetime. And one of the things that he loved was the relationship. And then as he got older, and I guess, and I'm sure as well as anyone, and any other doctor, the whole medical system has really, really changed in the last 10, 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have a relationship with patients. He wasn't even allowed to, like, the patients weren't allowed to even request to have him as a doctor again. It was just whoever was on call at that point would just walk in and see you. And he really felt that he was really missing out on that. But you didn't feel like you had the opportunity to kind of teach through vis-a-vis seeing patients?
So I did, and I liked that, but I wanted something more.
You wanted more.
I want,
It didn't itch that scratch
well,
enough.
and it's funny that you bring that up because a lot of people have a perception that for physicians, it's always one particular thing that we all share that fulfills that need. And in reality, it is a huge range
Hmm.
of different things that people really like to do. So, for example, I mean, there are physicians who don't see any patients at all and they do research,
Yeah,
right? And that is their entire focus because what they want to contribute to the patient is not seeing them on a day-to-day basis, but finding some discovery that's going to make a major impact on
everyone.
a whole bunch of people at the very least. And so I think that one of the things that you have to find, at least in medicine, if you're going to be successful in your career, is what is the thing that gets you out of bed, right? What's the thing that really gets you going? Who are you?
Right.
And, I think that there's a perception that it's got to be patient care all the time. Um, for a lot of people, it's not.
Right.
That's part of it. And that's a huge role. For me, it is. I
Hmm.
love seeing my patients. I think that it would be unfulfilling for me not to continue to
Sure.
see some patients in some way. But at the same time, I also like other things that can make a huge impact, right? So, for example, for me, teaching is I I get so much gratification out of seeing somebody who I've taught go on to be an outstanding psychiatrist,
Awesome.
right? Because to me, that's magnified. That's a force multiplier
Sure.
for your efforts because now you get to watch that person do amazing work. I have to say that in this department here, I'm lucky in that a couple of people that I've trained are some of our faculty,
Yeah.
and
It's
they're
awesome.
outstanding.
It's
And
awesome.
being able to watch them just be amazing doctors is that's an accomplishment. I
Yeah.
mean, and sometimes you sit back and you look at it and you go, and you don't take credit for that, right?
Hmm.
Like you helped guide them to get to the right spot, but at the same time, the fact that you even got to contribute to that,
Sure.
and you got to contribute to multiple people doing that, how many patients does that impact? It's really hard to calculate, but you feel it and
Yeah.
you see it. And so at the time, I didn't know that that was what I
Yeah.
cared so much about with education. But that's one of the things that that was it was the kernel that developed from there. Of For me at least, it's getting people to their maximum potential. It's helping remove barriers, get them to the right stage where they can be the best that they can. And so that started with education. And then, over time, somehow insidiously, it got into administration,
Sure.
right? Which is, the close cousin of that. But I think shares that same thread, which is that you want people to do the best that they can.
Right.
And so, coming back and starting a fellowship here, that was really my journey back in academics.
So, can you walk me through a little bit what those first 3 years were like in terms of getting it started up?
Yeah, so first 3 years were me running around doing a lot of conversations with attorneys about why USF has forensic services again, right?
Isn't why they should have it or why they do have it?
Why they well but, at the time, I mean, they did have it, but that was because I was there,
That's
right?
it. Right.
That was it.
Yeah.
And then and we had a couple of people who were doing some part-time work and things, and they were helpful, but we had not reached a critical mass by any stretch of the imagination. And so that first 3 years was a couple of things. One was just getting my feet wet down here in Tampa. Two was learning the university system.
Hmm.
And then three was getting the word out there that, hey, we're going to be doing this. It's not just the training, but also a service that we're going to provide. We're going to do it a little bit different than some
Sure.
people in the community do. For example, it's not going to be based on volume. It's going to be based on quality,
Right.
So yeah, it's going to end up perhaps costing you a little bit more. It's going to take a little bit more time, but you're going to get the best report or testimony that you can from somebody here in this region.
Sure.
And that's what we were pushing
It's amazing.
because we that's how you build an education program on, right? Nobody goes to a program that says, "Oh, well, we're pretty good," right?
Right.
Like we're striving to be the best in the community.
Yeah.
And then the best in the state, and then the best in the region.
Yeah.
There was always moving those kind of hurdles. So those first 3 years were just getting enmeshed in the system, getting our feet wet, getting the word out there, and then making sure that we had the resources to start the program.
Right.
Looking back at it, it's a bit of a blur because the time went pretty fast.
It did.
And then we were there. We were ready to start an application for our fellowship program.
Wow. Did you feel, well, I find that there are different experiences that I'll have in my life depending what I'm going through and what point in time it is, where you have the understanding that what you're going through is going to be significant and it's going to be formative. And then there's the collection of little experiences that when you look back, you say, oh, that's where all that was leading up to. Did you feel during that point in time that it was like just little bits of like tidbits and then you look back and it was all done? Or do you think the whole step, you're like, I'm one step closer to a big goal and I'm so excited about that?
So actually, I would say both, interestingly, because for the education side of things and getting the fellowship together, I thought that most definitely we were taking strides towards a bigger goal. I
Mhm.
mean, the goal was first fellow here, getting
Very
trained.
exciting, right?
Right. At the same time, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit, is that what was starting to, looking back, snippets of where I would go later, that was more the administrative stuff, because had you asked me if I was going to be a department chair, 10 years ago, I told you, no way. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like, that's just, it's not my particular thing. But I think, looking back, there were some things that came up back then that led me to say, that's a role that I could actually find myself doing
Right.
and being quite effective in. I think what those little kernels were at the time, those little things that were kind of shaping it were finding problems that people were having and fixing them, right? And so at the time, it was, well, we don't have very good services in the forensic community here in this area. Okay, well, let's fix that.
How do you
right?
do that? You hire new people? Do you get more on top of it? Do you make sure that things are more tight? Like, what do you do about
Well,
that?
you identify the problem first.
Right.
I mean, you identify it, and then you start coming up with solutions because a lot of times people don't know what their problem is.
Yeah.
People will just say, "Well, there are bad services here." Well, what makes them bad?
Right.
Is it that the quality of the report is poor? Is it that the person is seeing 10 evaluations a day rather than really honing in on one? Is it because when the person comes to testify that, they basically just say, well, I don't have a reason for my opinion, but I'm just going to give it anyways,
Right.
right? Those were some of the
That
things
sounds like a couple of problems.
it does. And so once you find those, do you have to hire into them? Depends on the problem. Sometimes it's just simply saying, well, that's not the way to do things. We're just going to do it differently,
Okay.
right? But,
Was there resistance in that? Or was there the understanding that we're trying to overhaul and we're all trying to accomplish something better?
there's always resistance anytime there's change.
How do you deal with confrontation?
Well, you try to.
How do you deal with
How do
it?
I deal with it? One of my first things, and this is for better or worse. I mean, one of the first things that I'm focused on is solutions, right? So if you hand me a problem, I really don't love the blame game at all.
Sure.
I want to look for solutions immediately. And so if you've identified that something is not working properly, how can you fix it? And so typically whenever I deal with confrontation, I try to find out what it is that that person wants to be done.
Yes.
And then we try to come up with a solution for it. Now, does that always work? No. And every once in a while, I get some feedback that says, I don't want to hear a solution. I just want you to listen to me
Hmm.
complain. Um,
From women or something like that.
well,
I'm just kidding.
no. I mean, that's it. It's a universal thing.
Yeah, it is.
Sometimes people just want to unload, and I respect that.
Yeah.
What? But it's not my natural orientation. My natural orientation is
Right.
you hand me a problem, let's come up with solutions. I
Yeah.
don't have to be the one to fix it, but like let's start coming up with them. And so that's what we did with some of the problems that were going on sort of in the forensic community around here was, okay, you, uh, you're not used to us being around. You're not used to this type of evaluation. Is there something that you do think we can help with? Is there something
That's awesome. Put the ball in their court.
anything that you think that we can identify? And if so, well, then let's start there. That's the common ground, right?
Yeah.
And then we expanded out from there, and I have to say that it worked out beautifully. We ended up the university's very well respected whenever it comes to providing forensic psychiatry now,
Hmm.
and I think part of that was that early on of that suspiciousness of, well, you're going to come in and say that the current services are not as good as they could be. Show us what they could be, right? Show us a solution.
Yeah.
And that actually helped us to get across the finish line for a lot of those confrontations earlier.
I think we need a lot of that in general. I think that's a really, because I think it's a really healthy. One of the things I've also noticed when working with my dad's not very good at confrontation, and as his son, it's very easy for me to be confrontational and play the blame game, right? Oh, you did this and you didn't call back, blah, 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 and there was one point where he and I were really having a couple of really, really tough weeks, maybe even a couple of months. Like every couple of years, we go through a stretch where like a couple of months are tough between us. Actually, it's part of the reason why we don't work in the same state. He's in New York and I'm in Florida, and I realized at one point, I called him up and I said, and this was in the middle of everything. I called him. I was like, "Pop, I don't want to be mad at you. I don't want to fight with you. I think, and I don't want to blame you. I don't want to yell at you." I was like, "What can we do to get this problem resolved? Like we know that this is an issue. I don't want to blame you. I don't want to yell at you. I don't want to be mad at you. How do we fix it? What do we do?" And it changed everything. The second I open my and for the future too, and for the future, and I always know that that's like my ace in the hole in terms of if I feel like I can't get through to him, to hang up, give him a couple of minutes to just settle, and then call him back and say, "I don't want to be mad. I know that you don't want to be mad either. What do we do to solve this?" And it's been the best solution creator that I've ever learned in my entire life. I learned that I'm only married for I'm coming I guess almost 4 years now, but that's also in terms of our relationship, there are times where I just say to my wife like, what what can we do to fix it? Like what I know you're upset. I'm really sorry. I don't want how do we get to the next place? How do we find the problem over here? And it's the best thing.
The only thing I would caution though is the same thing that I've gotten feedback on regularly, which is everybody has a different threshold for how much that they need to just sit with the situation
Sure.
before that they move on and stuff. I'm very keen on if there's a problem, boom, it needs to get fixed, right? And sometimes that doesn't work out in the timetable, right? It's something that has to be put on the back burner that might get fixed eventually, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I've learned over time. And then sometimes people just want to not think of a solution and just sit with it for a little bit. And so, for example, one of the things that I'll do from time to time is if somebody is calling me to, just vent or complain or something like that, I might just say, are we looking for solutions today, or do you just need to vent?
Yeah.
Because if you need to vent, I'm fine.
Yeah.
Like I'll listen. I'll give a little bit of insights here and there. But for the most part, I'm not gonna jump on a solution. And that's taken a lot for me to develop that over time because it's not my natural inclination. My natural inclination is put the problem in front of me and we're going to rush headlong into it. We're going to conquer this immediately.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how everybody functions.
Yeah.
And that needs to be respected because if you don't, what you end up doing is gaining a reputation as somebody who just runs rough over people,
Sure.
right? And that can be just as damaging because then people don't trust that they can feel safe talking to you about things and such. I mean, it's always a balance because you'd love to just say, "I'm going to fix everything. I'm going to go and I'm going to solve that solution." But then you might actually push people away from coming to you with the problem
Sure.
if they feel like you're immediately going to hammer on it the moment that you do. So it's an interesting balance, and again, you have to know what your own self bias is towards
Yeah.
that, and then you have to modify that in
Yeah.
some way.
Yeah.
And I say this like it's like an easy thing. I mean, I'm still working on this.
Yeah, it's a lifelong pursuit. I'm sure. I'm sure. Yeah, just the other day, even I was just talking to my wife about a couple of things that were just on my mind recently, and I was saying that it was things are X, Y, and Z is bothering me, and it's been weighing on me. It's on my mind, and haven't been it's just keeping me up a little bit. And I called her on my way here, and I said, I just want to let you know, like, I really appreciate you just like listening to me here. And she goes, I felt bad because you were talking to me last couple of nights about this, and I didn't have anything to tell you. And I was like, you don't need anything. Like the fact that that I'm sharing this with you is exactly just what I wanted. I wanted to know that you're like that you're like it's even for myself to show that our relationship is okay, that I could be vulnerable in this way, and you're just gonna accept it, understand, help support me, and then we'll figure out a solution whenever you figure out a solution, but at least you get a chance to do that.
It's a good word that you use about vulnerability. One of the things that I had not considered to be a critical part of leadership that I learned from a couple of really good leaders that I know personally is this concept of how important vulnerability is. You know, um, because a lot of people think that you need to just be this stoic, nothing ever phases you kind of individual, and actually that's good for kind of baseline. I actually find that that's one that I prefer as sort of the baseline. But sometimes you have to be able to say, I'm having a rough time this week, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I'm a little snappy, it's because X, Y, and Z is going on. And I'm human too. And it
Yeah.
takes a little bit for me to get through that, and we'll be good by next week. But just FYI, going to be that way this week.
Yeah.
And you don't want to use that every single week because then that becomes problematic. But the
It
ability,
makes you human, makes you relatable.
well, and people respect that,
Yeah.
right? Because then it's like, well, wait a second, I get that at least this person's being open rather than not telling me things, right? It's also funny how much I've developed a desire for transparency over the years. And I've always liked for people to know things and such, but every year I find it's more and more and more vital, particularly in leadership, to be able to say, hey, I'm going to give you as much information as I can that we know for certain so that everybody's informed,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, again, it's a balance though. It's tempered. One of my favorite quotes from one of my mentors is, transparency without a plan is chaos. And that can absolutely be true, particularly when things are in flux and you're not quite sure where things are going and the information switches back and forth,
Yeah.
and you don't have stable ground to present. But it's funny that you bring that up because it sparks to my mind immediately that those are two traits that when I started to get into some of these more leadership roles, I didn't realize just how important transparency and vulnerability were. And now I've moved those further and further and further up the list of qualities that you have to have, because if you don't have those, you don't have trust, and you also are setting yourself up to just go absolutely bonkers doing
Mm-hmm.
any of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I found I stumbled into the vulnerability thing from a young age. I was always going to camp, and I was always a counselor or a division head or a teacher or whatever it was in some capacity. I love that stuff, and even if I don't do it full time, like I always try to keep a couple of classes that I'm teaching or do a couple of. And one of the first experiences that I had was, I think I was maybe 15 or 16 years old. No, I was probably 16 or 17, and I was a very, very introvert and insecure kid. Um, Probably still a little bit, but a lot less sure of myself and a lot less understanding of I don't understand myself very well. And summer camp was the best thing for me. I went from New York to Wisconsin. I went, I'd fly into either Milwaukee or O'Hare, and I'd take a 4-hour bus into the middle of Wisconsin, and then I'd just be with a bunch of people that I only got to see once a year, like the conference, right? And it was
Yeah.
and the first year, and I only went for, I think, I went for 5 years, the first 2 years were very, very challenging for me. And then I really found myself and I found my groove. And then my last year I was a division head. And one of the things they asked me to do was to speak to the campers. And I told them the story. I didn't know what I was going to talk about. And I told them the story of of a guy that got to camp for the first time and how insecure he was and how important it was that other people just said, like, hey, what's your name? Like, it's nice to meet you. And and I said the whole table, and then I said the whole story up, and then I said, and that guy was me. And at that point, anyone that knew me at that point knew me as this, lively, fun, outgoing kind of guy, and their jaw, and no one could believe it, and like people were crying. Like, the room, I was crying. It was a very, very deeply emotional experience, but I immediately grasped that the vulnerability and the honesty and the combination of all three of them, and just, you never know, what doing that's going to do for someone else, and then what they could become from that. I found for my entire life, dealing with customers. A customer calls me up. He's really upset. I'm really sorry I let you down. I'm really trying to fight. I'm trying to fight for you on behalf of my company, and I I'm really sorry. It's a really bad feeling, and I want and I don't feel good about this either. I want to work with you and try to get a solution. And it was really it's really, really an amazing thing. But it's hard because vulnerability. I like to give the example. It's like giving someone a weapon. It's like giving someone a hammer, and you trust that they're not going to hit you with the hammer. You trust that they're going to use it to help build something, but you never know, and that's kind of what the risk is. You always have to assess whether or not this person you're giving a hammer to is someone that you should be giving it to at all.
Yeah, but if you're practicing it across the board, it's not as much of a hammer anymore, because if
Hmm.
you say to the person, hey, I had a rough day, and that person runs out and tells everybody else, if you're practicing kind of across the board,
Yeah.
others know that you're human and you have rough days, and it's totally fine.
Yeah.
So, I think that it's one of those things that it's probably the hardest to get over that barrier initially, but then to continue to use it gets easier and easier and
Yes,
easier,
definitely.
right?
Yeah,
Because, it's just that snowball effect that happens.
definitely. Definitely. I wanted to ask you about medications in psychiatry.
Okay.
Um, I Can you explain in as simple terms as possible what SSRIs are and and the different variations of medications that people use to treat psychiatric illnesses are?
Sure. So, it's a broad question. I'll start out with kind of the bigger picture, and then we can talk about specific things like SSRIs. So, at the broader level, what most medications are trying to do is to try to help with problems in receptors, right? Something in the brain, either it's the brain chemical, it's the receptor itself, it's something that has damaged the brain,
Hmm.
it's something that is happening to the brain physiologically. Something is going on that we want to end up
Yeah.
making more regulated, right? I don't want to say fix because fix brings to mind cure. You take one pill, it's like penicillin, your
Yeah.
infection is gone, and you trot on with your life. But more to make sure that it's working properly and in a stable way. And so it depends on the condition, right? And for example, most of the medications that we use for psychosis, which is hearing voices, seeing
Sure.
things that aren't there, delusions, that sort of thing.
What falls under? What are some common things that fall under psychosis? Schizophrenia is one of them.
So schizophrenia is probably the one that most people think about.
Mhm.
Delusional disorders where the person doesn't have the other features of schizophrenia. Schizoaffective disorders where it's kind of like schizophrenia, but they also have mood disorders on top of that, like major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder.
That stuff is also considered.
Uh,
It's all under that umbrella.
it can be depending on the diagnosis.
Okay.
Then we have the broader umbrella of mood disorders, which are major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and a number of others. Anxiety disorders,
Hmm.
like generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder. You get into other kind of more narrow categories like obsessive compulsive disorders, so OCD, post traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And then you get into some of the ones that are more developmental. So, from as early in life as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or
Yeah.
ADHD, and autism spectrum disorders to later in life, where you might develop a major neurocognitive disorder, what we used to call dementia, or what we still call Alzheimer's disease,
Yeah.
right? So there's a huge range of different psychiatric conditions, but the common thread is that they involve the brain in
Yeah.
some way, a functional aspect of it. And so often the medications that we use target whatever the current science tells us is the target to go after, right?
Okay.
And I say that
That's a very
it is a
cautiously
very
put.
cautious statement.
It's a very cautious
It's
statement.
a cautious statement because, one of the things that I think is troublesome in science sometimes is when we get into dogma and, the way that it is now is the way that it's always going to be, right? If that was the case, we would still be bloodletting like we were, back in medieval times in order to cure illness. We don't. We have a better understanding of things as they go. That leads to some controversy sometimes, where
Sure.
people will say, "Wait a second, my particular condition is not being treated by this medication," and there's variability in people, but our understanding is always growing.
Yeah.
And so medications have been developed in order to try to help the best that they can at this stage. But will it look the same 50 years from now?
Almost certainly not, right?
It's possible, I guess. I mean, there are certain areas where we don't really change things up, like how we treat certain bacterial infections, right? The
Sure.
same antibiotics have been around for a while. But I think that it's a little bit different in psychiatry because, there's such variability in different people that's where we find things can be less effective or have more side effects and those sorts of things. So, sometimes I hesitate a little bit whenever people say, "Well, is psychiatry more of a science or an art?" And I really hate that
I hear.
division of it, because it is a science, but it's a science that is not perfect and the same for every single person, right? And so, we're not in the phase yet where we're making personalized genetic therapies for psychiatric conditions. So we work with these broader medications that we do have access to. So, for example, with as we were talking about psychotic illnesses, one of the things that has been implicated in a lot of those hearing voices and things is dopamine, right?
Yeah.
Dopamine receptor being able to go and block that, so there's not as much dopamine.
There's too much dopamine would lead to potentially when someone has a psychotic condition, it's that there's not enough dopamine regulation. There's too much dopamine being released.
Simple explanation, yes.
Okay, that's yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of other kind of moderating factors that go into place there, but that's the basis for things like most of the
That's
antipsychotics
101.
we use,
That's
right?
101.
Right. So the idea is too much dopamine, block dopamine, gets better. And for a lot of people, it does,
Yeah.
actually. And so this is where some of our earlier antipsychotics come from. Some of the later ones kind of built upon that, starting to hit other receptors as well. And now there's more and more focus on trying to go away from the dopamine receptors, see if maybe there's another way to treat psychosis. But that's where that class of medications comes from, is our understanding of why that main symptom comes up and what receptor can we target.
Mm-hmm.
I bring that up because you asked specifically about SSRIs, which
Yeah.
are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Same idea, right? We find that
But serotonin is not dopamine.
it's not. It's not. But it's the same idea that we're targeting a specific receptor in order to try to treat a symptom. And
Mhm.
so, when it comes to antidepressants, serotonin has been the main one that we target a
Yeah.
lot. And some of the medications that had serotonin effect were quite effective. What they tried to do when they came out with SSRIs was to target that a little bit more specifically. Why? Because if we can get better treatment of the symptom, less side effects, that's always a good treatment, right?
But the serotonin impacts, I believe, I believe impacts other things like sleep and hunger and things like that, right? And those
It
are
does.
consequences. Those get impacted as a consequence of messing around with it, right?
It can. It
It can.
can. And not to mention that, let's go back to psychosis for a moment,
Yeah.
which is supposed to be dopamine,
Yeah.
except there's different subreceptors of dopamine. And there's serotonin that probably plays some sort of effect.
Uh-huh.
And there's 5 other different types
Yeah.
of receptors that do. So that's why I said kind of tongue-in-cheek that that's the simple explanation.
Right.
Because as we learn more and more and more, we find just how much all of these different things interact. I mean,
Yeah.
it would be so easy if the human brain had this channel equals this symptom, and you're done.
If only, right?
It doesn't, though. And so we have to be leery of targeting symptoms, but also not causing other effects. The SSRIs, for example, one of the side effects that can come up out of it is gastrointestinal
Hmm.
distress. A lot of people will experience that. Not most, but a
Yeah,
decent amount number of them. And part of that is because, obviously the serotonin in the medication itself can affect the gut even more than it can the brain at times in certain people. And so, the goal of it is to try to help people with depression, but might it also cause side effects that makes it intolerable for people? It can,
right.
right? So that's where the balance comes in with psychiatric medications, is trying to improve things without causing more side effects.
Sure.
Um, and so, that's the broader scope of psychiatric medications, is that they're a tool that can be used, but it's going to be a little bit different for everybody.
Mm.
And that's where a lot of people will bring in this, well, it's kind of an art because, it's not the same, it's not cookie cutter and that sort of stuff. Um, I think you could think of it in that way, but I think also that it's having an appreciation for how variable the human body is,
Yes.
and that's a science to me.
Yeah.
That's not an art. That's definitely a science to say we know that you and I are not the same. Our brains do not function in exactly the same way.
Sure.
If they did, this would be the easiest job in the world.
So you can really make a very strong case that psychiatrists should be um, have that long lasting relationship with the patient, because the longer you get to know them, the more you get to know the science and the art, right? The more you get to know the context of who that person is, environmental factors, the way that they're raised, what do they eat, what do they consume, do they exercise, do they take, what medications do they take, what are their relationships like, and when you have all that, like a meal in front, like all that in front of you, all that information, then and then you have the science as to what what the medications do. You can now apply what you need with the most knowledge that you have. I think the biggest problem that people have, or at least what you would say about the medical system that my grandfather was lamenting about, was that he doesn't have a chance to even get to know his patients
Yeah.
like that, to even get that full picture. So he's prescribing medication to someone, but he doesn't have he doesn't know the the full medical history. And sometimes the patient will forget to leave something out, but oh right, but didn't you mention that last time? Oh right, I did. Sorry, yeah, I knew that. But
That's one of the struggles that I have with some of the newer companies that have popped up that are call in, get an antidepressant, and
mhm.
we'll do a very quick evaluation.
That scares
You
me.
don't really need to get, it doesn't necessarily. I can see where it's scary.
Excuse me, we have a student that his parents have been trying to they didn't even know necessarily what the challenge is for him. It seems to be something with his processing. I'm not sure. And they've been essentially just, whoever's been prescribing a medication, it's been basically just a trial run. And it's had some pretty catastrophic consequences over the last year. He's been my student for 2 years now, coming up to the end of the second year. And he's just a different human being every 3 months. I mean, it's really, really crazy.
Well,
That's what's scary to me, just from my experience.
well, I mean, what I was going to say about this is that it's more of, the more information you have, the more you know what kind of variables that you're looking out for, which ones are important, right?
Hmm.
I do hear that very often. Oh, it feels like a trial. I've heard the thing, I feel like a guinea pig. You've tried
Yeah.
different medications. Um, there's some nuance to that, though, right? Because, like I just said before, we don't know how
Any.
somebody's going to respond to
Sure.
something a lot of the time. We have ways that we can kind of suspect it. We have, what perhaps your family has responded to in the past. We have what you've responded to in the past. So we have some guidance,
Sure.
but we're not quite sure. Where I think that there's also a nuance to that is, I don't, at the very beginning, it's sometimes hard for me to know what's important to you and what's not. So, for example, if a medication causes a certain side effect that just ruins an aspect of your life that you absolutely love,
Sure.
we can't use that medication, right?
Right.
Like, I mean, that's just the way that it is. So, even if I could, let's say, for example, that I could get you to, that you had really bad major depressive disorder, and I put you on something like bupropion, which is an antidepressant, and your symptoms get better and you look great, but it causes you not to sleep at night. and you like your sleep,
Yeah.
you can't function well on it. We can't use that medication,
Yeah.
right? And so, regardless of the fact that that was probably the quote unquote right call for you in terms of treatment, in terms of side effects, it's not.
Sure.
And that's one of the problems that I have with some of the companies that don't really get a full history for you, is that then they don't get that nuance,
Yeah.
right? Because then you might stop the bupropion and go on to something else, and it's considered to be a treatment failure, when in reality it worked great. It was just that you had to stop it because of these other side effects, right?
So
It doesn't complete that full picture, especially whenever we're guiding future treatments.
you wouldn't call a side effect as significant as, preventing sleep something to be you wouldn't consider that a failure in terms of the medication?
I think it's a failure in terms of it not being tolerable, but it still gives valuable information.
Right.
What
It cures what it serves as a cure in a sense.
it treats,
It
it
treats rather.
treats, and
Yeah.
it treats well, but that intolerable side effect is there. What I'd be concerned about is if I received a list of somebody's medications and it just said bupropion ineffective, right? Because that's not the story.
I
The
understand.
story
I
is
understand.
that
You
the
need more
person
detail than that.
I need that person actually did really good on the medication. It just caused this really bad side effect.
Right.
Because then what do I do? Do I try that again, but now use a sleep aid with that person? Do I use a similar medication? Do I go off in a completely different,
Mm-hmm.
ballpark? There's a lot of things that you can decide when you've got more information.
Yeah.
But trying to do it just by saying, you have major depressive disorder, so I'm starting you on X, that can be difficult in psychiatry.
Sure.
That's one of the reasons why we're a specialty, right?
Yeah.
And why whenever, sometimes people will say, oh, well, these other professions could just manage this, right? I guess that's true until it's not.
Right.
I absolutely love working with our primary care physicians to treat the vast majority of anxiety, depressive disorders, those sorts of things, and they can manage those quite effectively because it is pretty straightforward
Mm-hmm.
until it's not.
Right.
And then we need to end up being able to take that fuller picture. As you said, the meal in front of us to be able to really look at, okay, what are all the components? Because we're not going to get a really easy, quick fix here. We've got to figure out what are we trying to target, what are we trying to make better, and at the same time minimize any sorts of harms.
Yeah. 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 Definitely. Definitely. It's I guess taking too much time could get could get in the way of the bottom line. I guess you don't make as much money if time is money and you're incentivized to try to diagnose quickly because you want to be able to you want to help. I mean, I really really try to be very very charitable with people in general, and I think it's very reasonable to say that these companies want to help. They want to help,
Oh yeah.
and just because they're not helping the best way that they could doesn't mean that they're not trying to help and that they don't want to help, but you just need more detail. And I know, for example, myself, that sometimes I feel like just getting a lot done is what I want to do, and then I don't stop and think about what it is I'm actually doing. Enough time to actually consider the activity that I'm doing and enjoy the actual thing I'm doing. So you're so busy trying to get everything done. You're so busy trying to cover as many patients as possible. You never stop and think like, wait a minute, just because I knocked out 100 patients this month, I prescribe, I prescribed medication to 100 patients that are trying to help this month, but I probably would have done a better job if I did 50 and I really paid more attention to the patient, to the story.
I think that really plays into, particularly with different organizations, what is their goal? Is their goal to treat as many people as possible? Or is it to really focus on quality with a
Yes.
smaller number of people? And trust me, I get the financial pressures. I mean,
Sure.
one of the things that I deal with is things like budgets and revenues and those sorts of things. So I get that reality, and in fact, I probably have a little bit more business orientation than some physicians do. However, it brings me back to a formative quote that I remember somebody saying to me one time, which was, "If you provide the best quality, the revenue will come." Right?
Yes.
And
Sounds like a Steve Jobs quote, kind of.
it's not. It's actually somebody local here in a meeting one time, but it stuck with me, and I think that that's important because not everybody has that necessarily same philosophy, and that's okay.
Sure.
If you're a company that your job is volume, volume, volume,
Sure.
there's something to be said for that. And to your point, I can respect it too.
Yeah.
That if you say, hey, I may not do the best quality evaluation, but if I do double the number of people just by pure volume, I'm going to help more folks.
Yeah.
I get it.
Sure.
But you have to be very clear that that's what your mission and your goal is.
Yeah.
Our mission and our goal is to provide the best quality that we can. And obviously we want to be cognizant of things like revenues and such, because I mean it's important to make sure that we're capturing the visits that we're billing for and all those sorts of things. But the focus and the mission is the quality, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what people come to our setting for. Is they want that quality. They want the person who can deal with I've been to 3 other doctors and now finally I'm at the university and I want to see this person. Does that mean that we see less volume? Probably.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the trade-off.
Yeah.
And so, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing one way or the other. It's just you should know what you're doing so that then you can tell other people what you're doing. And if it is a volume proposition, great.
Just let everyone know. Yeah.
And be comfortable with that, right? And don't try to shift it to something else if it's not.
Right. What are your thoughts? I'm sure. I mean, I don't know whether this is something that I'm experiencing just in my circles or whether this is more universal. I have a feeling it's a little bit more universal, but there's tend to be since, and I say in the last 5 years since COVID, really, pretty deep distrust in medication and medicine nowadays. Whether it's SSRIs, whether it's vaccines, whether it's whatever it is, there just seems to be a lot of mistrust. Do you notice that psychiatrists feel the same way? Do you feel that these are founded distrust? Do you think that they're misunderstood? Do you think that it's a variety? What do you think is going on with all this? Because and also for just a common person, it's so overwhelming. You don't know what to find, what to think, what to do. I mean, there's so many.
So really, I would divide your question into 2 things. One is medicine in general and psychiatry. On the
Okay.
psychiatry of things, it's kind of interesting because at the same time that there's been more mistrust of medicine in general, there's been a lot more interest in psychiatry.
Really?
Because, if you think about it, we've always dealt with stigma within mental health. And then that stigma's gotten a little bit better and a little bit
Thank
better.
God.
And then COVID happened. And suddenly everybody went, wait a second, I'm sitting at home, I'm isolated, I'm starting to feel anxious and depressed. What is this?
Yeah.
And so people became much, much more interested in mental health. And so we've actually seen on our side of things sort of an explosion in interest towards identifying mental illnesses and treating them in a way that I haven't seen that happen in the past nearly as much.
Right. I'm sorry, can I just ask quickly, what would be the difference between in this particular case? How would someone decide to go to a psychiatrist as opposed to a psychologist? Because my initial reaction when someone says go to a psychiatrist, it means get a prescription, and I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that the fact that I just think that means that there's got to be something in the air that says that I'd be far more inclined to go to a therapist or a psychologist than I would to a psychiatrist, because I'd say, hey, I've got some anxiety, I don't really know how to deal with it. I'm going to go to, but I don't think that I don't think it's so full blown that I need medication or whatever.
Yeah, so part of that is just people trying to simplify what is the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist, right? And usually the simple answer is one can write medications and one can't. Another one that I hear is psychologists can do therapy and psychiatrists can't. And
is that true?
It's not. It's not actually. In fact, that was less true than the first one. The first one is true in most states, although there are some states now that will allow psychologists to have prescribing rights.
Cool.
On the opposite end of things, there are tons of psychiatrists that do therapy. And in fact, that's part of the training as a psychiatrist. You have to see a certain number of therapy patients. So I think that probably where that perception comes from is trying to reduce those down to those very simple, how can I recall the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist? What I would say is how people select where they go. Probably the first answer I have is see someone, right? I don't care who, if it's a psychologist, if it's a psychiatrist, because likely they're going to guide you to where you need to be. Every month I get a couple of patients who come in and see me, and at the end of the visit they go, "Well, what do you think I need to be on?" And I go, "You don't need to be on anything.
Yeah.
We need to get you in therapy.
Yeah.
That's what we need to do."
Yeah.
And so then we do, which is nice because we have a system, right?
That's
So
awesome.
I can refer that pretty easily. But I wouldn't get people will go in with a conception that they have that they're like, well, I need this or I need that. And what I always say is go to the professional in order to find out, what it is that their opinion is, and then work that out together,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if you just go in and say, I demand I have to be on fluoxetine because I read about it online,
Right.
right? Um, that may be true, and that may not be true.
Mm-hmm.
But why not leverage some of that knowledge that that physician has or the psychologist to help guide you in that?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you go to a psychologist and the psychologist notices that, hey, this is not just going to be treated with therapy alone, a good psychologist is going to say, I think you need to see somebody and get on some medication. A good psychiatrist, by the exact same, opposite end of that,
Yeah.
is going to be able to say, you know what, you don't need medication. You're dealing with a ton of life stressors right now. We need to get you some better coping skills. Let's get you in for some cognitive behavioral therapy or some other type of
And will the
therapy.
psychiatrist generally provide that themselves?
They could, or they could work with somebody.
Right.
The landscape is different for, it's changed over the years because obviously, there's far more need for psychiatrists than there are psychiatrists. So
There's far
they,
more need for psychiatrists.
oh yeah, the actual demand for them
Really?
is much higher than the supply. So sometimes that gets them into the role where they have to write medications and then partner with a therapist in order to be able to provide therapy. But there are still many psychiatrists that do therapy
Like
themselves.
The Sopranos.
Right. Although, here's the other thing is that sometimes we do therapy and we don't even call it that, right?
Right.
So, if you come in and you talk with somebody, you do a half-hour visit, and 20 minutes of that is devoted to
Sure.
just kind of going through, talking about your stressors, figuring those things out, providing a little bit of support, and then medications the last 10 minutes. Did you go for a med visit or did you go for a therapy visit? I mean,
Right.
and often they blend the
Depends what
two.
your insurance is there?
Well, it does play
Yeah.
a role in the way that it's usually ended up being billed because that's complicated in
Sure.
and of
Yeah. Yeah. We're
itself.
gonna avoid that.
We'll avoid that because it's just
That's a monster
you
that
want
we don't
about
want
2 hours on billing, we
to.
can do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the thing that the, we try to come back to your initial question, we try to reduce things to as simple as we can,
Good.
right? And so that question of, you go to a psychiatrist for medication, you go to a psychologist for therapy. I think a lot of that stems from just look in the last couple of minutes here where we talked about all of the, kind of shades of gray that come into
Sure.
those two different professions. It's hard for people to keep that in their heads, right?
Yeah.
People are going to listen to this and they're going to be like, huh, I'm going to forget everything he just said over the last 5 minutes, and all I'm going to remember is psychiatrist writes meds, psychologist doesn't, because it's simple,
Right.
right? And that's why people think about that. Your other part of your question before was
Distrust
distrust in medicine, right?
Yeah.
In general.
And I want to just to refine the question, or I guess to further elaborate.
Yeah,
It seems that there's more and more evidence that medicine doesn't have to be the first stop that you go to.
yeah,
That's how I'm gonna that other factors like diet or like exercise or community tend to have an enormous impact as well.
we all love simple answers, right? We
Sure.
all love simple things. And so if you have something going on, you would love to know that diet is what's going to fix it, or exercise,
Mhm.
or medication, or whatnot. What is really hard for people sometimes is to hear that it's diet, plus exercise, plus medication,
Sure.
plus all these other things. And so I do think that there is just a general wanting to keep things simple that sometimes causes folks to want to try, specific things that are outside of things like medications. And here's a couple other factors. One is, and this has been going on for quite some time, is there was a shift from back in the day that everything was the doctor's going to tell you what to do
Hmm.
and you're going to do it, right? Now, is that good or bad? I think we can make some really good debates that it was not a good situation, right? We
Right.
want to have patient centered care. We want the patient to be the focus of it and then to help make decisions. And so we've made some major strides with that. However, there's consequence of that. And the consequence is that people start to question things,
Sure.
right? So I think that's been building up over years. I think where we started to see it shift even more, though, has been that everybody has a platform nowadays, right? So regardless if you read something on a forum one
Yeah,
time and now you're the expert in
sure.
it, or you're truly the expert in that, everybody can get roughly equivalent platforms. And so if people are spreading information that isn't really based in science, it can be difficult to sift through that.
Definitely,
And
definitely.
so,
That's the problem that everyone's experiencing now. You don't know who to listen to, what to do, and there's such a lack of institutional trust now. I feel like that it makes it even worse. I almost feel like if a lot of the institutions that people have lost their trust in apologized and just said we did things that we said things or did things that and we lost people's trust and we acknowledge that and we want to work on rebuilding that. I think that would resolve an enormous amount of this problem of not knowing who to listen to.
yeah, I think also that there's a cultural problem where certain institutions are held to a different standard than others, right?
Sure.
For example, if we say that the science is evolving, and so what we were doing in psychiatry, for example, 100 years ago is very different than what we're
Hmm.
doing now, is that because of abuses, which there are some,
Hmm.
um, or was it just that things evolved over time, right?
Yeah.
And so, I like to think about weather prediction, right? Nobody really gets bent out of shape when the weatherman is wrong.
Especially in Florida.
They don't go back and make them like apologize for it or anything like that. And in fact, I mean, they keep their jobs and they keep doing it. And in fact, they try to get better models and they try to get better predictions and things like that. And they do get better over time. But people aren't saying, well, you should go back and say like that you were wrong
No, but the
before.
weatherman wouldn't say while it's raining that it's sunny outside either.
I don't know. It is Florida.
It
Like,
is Florida for sure.
um,
And while this part of the building could be raining and that part could be sunny, I
That's true.
totally
That's
understand.
true. But I do think that there needs to be an understanding that things do evolve over time and we gain
Sure.
more knowledge. Now, where I will definitely agree is when we do gain knowledge, let's get it out there, right?
Yes.
Like if something has changed, let's not just be dogmatic about it. Like you should question everything, right? But once we have some good evidence to back it up, do you get paralyzed and say, I'm not going to do anything about it? I'm
Right.
going to wait till I have absolute certainty and then nothing ever gets done?
Yeah.
Or do you have a recognition that this is the best information we have right now? This is what we're going to use. And then as new information comes in, we're going to shift, right? Um, you know, I one of the things that frustrates me is when people can't make a decision, right? And then there's no progress with it. The other thing that frustrates me though is when people make a decision and will never ever change their opinion at
Hmm.
all. There's got to be that middle ground
Yeah.
where you should always be on that upward trajectory,
Yeah.
And yes, you were at a less knowledgeable state before, but you should always be trying to move it up
Sure.
and recognize that may look very different than what it did 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, and this kind of brings it back to kind of that mistrust, is that for some reason we've gotten to that point where if you were not 100% correct before, that somehow indicates that you did the wrong thing, right? So
Ah.
if things were, if we gain new information and now we're doing things differently, was what was done before wrong? And sometimes it is.
Well,
Sometimes
only if
it's
you
very
find
clear.
out that they knew about it and didn't do it.
Correct. Right. And
Right.
that would be a situation where they do. And that's where I say that, when you look at things, question if it was done wrong in the past, was that really an abuse of things or was that
I don't.
more just a lack of knowledge?
I would probably gravitate towards the latter.
Yeah.
I would probably gravitate. Yeah. I mean, there's so many freaking things in my life that there's so many dumb things that I've done, and I continue to. I mean, I continue to do stupid things all the time, but that I really really work hard to be okay to say I didn't know that, I was wrong about that, and now I'm better about it. I think it's a real and it almost takes a certain confidence in yourself that you're okay with admitting that that you didn't have all that information in the past, that you didn't know then. I think. I mean, I don't know.
I think one of the keys to that, though, to bring it back to the institutions, is we as people have to be willing to allow institutions to say that. And sometimes we don't. Sometimes we say, oh, well, we're not going to let you take that back. Like, you were wrong and, you should be punished for it or
Right.
something like that. And that's where it gets confrontational a
Sure.
lot of times. You
Sure.
know, if you ever go on, different forums and things like that, you'll look and you'll see people who are so entrenched of, vaccines are terrible, vaccines are wonderful, right?
Hmm.
And it depends on their lens and their viewpoint. Where I actually see common ground is whenever people will say, well, let's discuss it and let's maybe,
I love that.
come to
Yeah.
that. The bad thing is that doesn't happen as often as we'd like. A lot of times it's folks staying entrenched, and if they can find anything that the other side did wrong,
Yes.
then it's no longer well,
It's
let's fix
ammo. It's
that.
ammo.
It's ammo.
Yeah.
It's ammo. And so it's a let's punish them for that
Yeah. Yeah.
rather than it being
There's a
a
vendetta. It's not a search for truth. It's a blame game. It's exactly what we were talking about earlier.
right.
It's the whole thing.
Let's not find a solution. Let's find somebody to blame, and let's
Yes.
all be satisfied that we blamed somebody
Yeah.
for it. That's unfortunately that's very prevalent.
So how do you feel about the concept of quote unquote heads need to roll? That like someone screwed something up, they said something wrong on a public forum that led to thousands or millions of people doing something that was incorrect with the best information they had, by the way, granted. And then you find out that it's not true, and then they get fired. Or that they don't get fired, and it was like, how come that guy didn't get fired, or that girl didn't get fired, or whoever it was didn't get fired? They were wrong, and they impacted millions of people. Like on one hand, and I guess this comes with how charitable you want to be.
Right.
What's that? Do you believe that person was trying to do that? Do you find out that there was a kickback? Do you find out that there was not, that they really were just trying to do the best they could with information? Like, what do you feel about the whole notion that like heads need to roll? Or you don't, it depends on the scenario.
Of course. I mean, I'm going to say it depends because
Yeah.
like that's the easy answer. I would say this. I don't believe in the knee jerk. There has to be someone to blame.
I don't
Right.
either, right?
You know, there sometimes is. There are sometimes is, and you may choose that person needs to, be fired or whatnot, and it's because you don't have confidence in their abilities now. You're worried about what their decisions might be in the future. They did not meet the terms of what their job was, and so that's a good reason to say you should no longer have that job if you're not
Hmm.
going to meet it. I think those are all valid, right? And it
Yeah.
depends on the situation. But just to say somebody's got to be to blame so that it makes it easy on everyone. I
Yeah.
struggle with that
I hear.
because sometimes it's not that easy, right? Most of the times it's a lot of different factors and who carries the weight of the blame and things. That's why and I think that's perhaps one of the reasons that I have had struggles with when people play the blame game is I don't see the utility in it. I think that the main utility is that again, people want things simple, right?
Hmm.
There's the bad guy.
Yeah.
That's the bad guy.
Yeah.
That's who I've got to punish. And if you can do that, then it's simple. It helps move people towards that. But is that going to fix the problem?
Almost never.
And it almost never does. And so I can see where the utility of it is. I just don't buy it.
I hear. I want to ask you one question, and then I want to talk a little bit about psychedelics.
Okay.
My brother-in-law just got diagnosed about a year ago with epilepsy. Can you explain what that is and any kind of research that you've come across in terms of treatment or any kind of, do you have any, what do you know about epilepsy?
So not my area for the
Okay.
most part. Usually neurology deals with that.
Okay.
And it's one of those things where we both deal with the brain, but we usually go off in kind of different tangents with it.
Hmm.
Epilepsy is a condition that is marked by people having seizures of some sort.
Sure.
Um,
Probably the scariest thing in the world. I was there one time for a seizure, and it was one of the scariest experiences of my life. It's crazy.
I've heard many describe it that way, and I've seen a fair number of people who have had seizures before. There's a lot of different causes. There's also a lot of different treatments and medications for it, as well
What's the
as
root? How does it happen? What's happening?
it depends. It depends on the type of seizure. I mean, really, it's like we talked about with some of the psychiatric conditions. It's some sort of dysfunction in the brain, right? That's occurring. Is it a physiological thing? Is it a structural thing? All of these can potentially cause seizures, but it's going to be different depending on the cause.
I see. It's so funny that you say that because I've never heard that. I've never heard any because I've heard and I've spoken to a couple other doctors. Actually, there's a doctor I'm pretty good friends with who's a neurologist and he works at the VA in West Palm, and I was talking to him about it, and he gave pretty much just one clear cut, like this is what it is and this is how you treat it, and I mean I don't know because he's still having seizures, but
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree because I think that it's tough because let's say, for example, children have febrile seizures, which is when they have high fevers, they can
yeah.
actually have seizures. I mean, that's a
Is that
physiological
epilepsy? Does
difference.
that go into is that
It's not epilepsy.
right?
It's a seizure itself. But then let's say, for example, somebody has seizures because they have a brain injury, and so that there's some scar tissue or something
Hmm.
like that that prevents the brain from functioning properly. So I think you can reduce it down to something simple like the brain is misfiring in
Yeah,
certain regions, which is probably close to the explanation that you got. Um, but why? Like that's always my thing is we can call it that. I could say that depression is failure of the brain to produce certain brain chemicals that make you happy. That's great. But which brain chemicals,
sure.
where, why are they not doing that? All of those sorts
Yeah,
of things. That's where it goes from simple to, hey, this is why this is complex to treat.
right. We need a really nuanced doctor, I guess, is what you're saying.
I think what you need is you just need to look at the whole picture,
Yeah,
right? I mean, if trying to just look at one very small snippet of things without looking at a broader picture, you're usually not going to find a good answer
right.
for it.
Okay, perfect. Well, then let's talk about psychedelics, the topic that I originally reached out to you about, and we're an hour and
I was going to
40
say,
minutes into this.
I love how that's gotten pushed to the back
Yeah,
burner.
I'm so, you know what? I do this all the time. I get so caught, I enjoy this so much, and I get so caught up in the conversations and just wherever it leads that I usually tend to forget, what the original thing was. Let's talk a little about psychedelics. Can you explain, unless you're telling me that it's unless it's not this specific, what happens when you take a psychedelic, or what happens when,
So it depends on the psychedelic. So let me back up for a second. And one of the ways that I got into this was, and I think the way that we originally connected. So after I did the whole forensic fellowship thing, we got that cranking and such. I started to move a little bit more into the clinical operations side of things. And, before I took over in my current role, I was starting to get into clinical trials a bit
okay,
more. And one of the things that I really liked about that was that those are the cutting edge developments
hmm,
where they're bringing something new to market, and they need to make sure as to safety and efficacy and all that sorts of things. Um, I am a big proponent of I like things that interest me, right? Which
sure.
makes sense. You hear something really and you go, wow, that's cool.
Yeah,
That to me is the types of stuff that I like to be involved in. And so one of the ones that we had come up was a trial for the use of psilocybin, which is the compound within hallucinogenic mushrooms, to treatment resistant depression. And so I started to get into that, and that expanded out to starting to look into this a little bit more and getting asked by some people to give some education and do some talks on it. So that's how I got into this. Was hey, neat treatment, sounds really interesting.
right,
Let's see what this looks like.
cool.
And so when it comes to psychedelics, remember psychedelics is a broad term for a number of different reality altering
Compounds.
compounds, right?
Right.
And we're talking stuff that was primarily looked at back in the 60s and 70s and now is coming back to the forefront as hey, can this actually work in the right setting?
Right.
And it really depends on the compound, right? So if we're talking something like psilocybin, we're probably talking a lot of serotonin that it's acting on.
So what? Yeah, can you explain how that works? So you take psilocybin. So someone ingests psilocybin, probably orally, and then what happens?
Well, if you're looking for an exact mechanism, I can actually show it to you, and it comes out and stuff like that. Bad news. This is psychiatry. That's a little bit difficult, right?
Okay.
Um, but what we kind of know is that it encourages the release of serotonin, right?
Okay.
And so that there's more impacts of that on the brain. Okay, and so often what people will experience in particularly something like psilocybin is that this increase in serotonin is thought to increase um, different perceptual, not disturbances necessarily. I mean, we could describe it as such, but perceptual changes.
Hmm.
And the idea behind why those have started to be used for treatment-resistant depression is, does that make your brain more able to change a bit, right? To change your thinking, to be a little bit more plastic,
Right.
to change, to be more open to delving into experiences or to,
So the
have
release of
insights.
serotonin is correlated or connects to your brain's neuroplasticity or plastic.
Well,
Keep it going.
that's part of the theory behind it, right?
Oh, it's a theory. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, like many of these things, and that's why I
What is
say
it?
kind of tongue in cheek that this is psychiatry. We don't have. I wish that we had a very easy scope that I could just look in
Yeah,
here
just see what happens.
and see exactly what's coming out. We obviously have good studies that can show, hey, taking this particular compound causes increase in serotonin receptor activation, which then leads to these, difference in perceptual or sensory uh, uh, experiences. So obviously that must be related, right? But again, that's still kind of putting pieces together, all right?
Yeah.
We don't have a great just piece of art in front of us that says, well, this is the entire picture. We're still kind of piecing those together over time because it is difficult to, again, we don't have a scope that we can just look into your brain and say, hey, look at those. They're going down the highway of serotonin, and there it is.
What else releases serotonin to that extent, and is that correlated with being used to treat depression? Like, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, that's why other psychedelic substances are being looked at as well, right?
So
So
psychedelics seem to release. What about non-psychedelic compounds? Like, is there medication, or is there experiences, or is there anything that people, I guess, any other compounds that release serotonin
For the most
that we
part,
can
most of
study?
the medications that have looked at this have actually looked at the opposite end of things, which is the reuptake side. So this kind of brings us back to the
Yes,
SSRIs
SRIs.
because, in their name themselves, it's the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor.
It's
So
stopping the.
it's stopping the reuptake because you think about it, your brain loves to recycle things. You're actually, your body's probably pretty good at recycling, and so one of the things it does is it likes to chew up serotonin and reuse it to re-release it. However, if we leave it kind of floating around for a little bit longer, and this is a very kind of simplistic version of it, the thought is that then that can encourage the mood to improve. We're hitting that receptor more because there's more of it floating around.
Oh, I see. So it's stopping the recycling process by leaving the serotonin to be floating, I guess.
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
that's the theory behind it. That's why it's actually in the name. Um, what we're seeing with psychedelic substances is it more serotonin release? Is it just actually hitting that receptor and activating it?
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of different pathways. But to your question of, are there a lot of medications that are focusing on that currently? Really, no. And so that's why this has
Wow.
become a newer area. Is, can we impact this in a different way?
What
Now,
causes the release of serotonin, generally speaking?
it depends on the physiological process that needs to happen, right?
Does
So,
it happen naturally? Does our brain naturally release
oh
serotonin? Just
yeah,
running release serotonin? Just playing like what?
yeah. So, doing things that make you happier, things that are pleasing to you, those sorts of things, all of that encourages serotonin release. Um,
Okay.
so, in some ways, what we're trying to do is to get what the body should be doing it right.
It's when I've had some very profound self-realizations while I jog, and it will hit me like a train. Like there'll be times where I'll be on a jog. I've been jogging for almost a decade now, and I love it. I used to hate it, and I still don't like love it, but I love that. I love the feeling of forcing myself to do something that I don't want to do, and the feeling of exercising and pushing myself through it. And whenever I've had like things bubbling below the surface that I wasn't sure like what I'm feeling, I either write or I jog,
Mhm.
and and then when I jog and it hits me, it's like it's an epiphany. I mean, it's I didn't even know that it was there, and it'll actually stop me in my tracks. I'll stop running. This past I bought my first house about 9 months ago, and 10 months ago I was on a jog and I just stopped. I called my wife and I said, I am so scared. It's 6.6% mortgage. I've never had bills like this before. I don't know if I could handle it, and and I said that, and I've been and I realized that it's been weighing on me for probably 2 3 months, since we started looking into the process, and it just exploded. Do you think that the serotonin released from jogging would have an impact on my self-realization about that in a similar way that people like use, again, it's like, psilocybin for therapy to come to
I maybe not in the exact same way, but I think that there's definitely a role of if exercise is encouraging the release of neurotransmitters, that can make things more clear
I see.
sometimes. Is it all serotonin? Again,
Yeah.
I wish it
Yeah.
was. If it was,
Awesome.
this would be great, right? We would find some way to just load you up on serotonin.
Yeah.
Everybody would be great.
Yeah.
There'd be no problems. But is there a little bit of dopamine in there? Is there a little bit of norepinephrine? Is there a little bit of all sorts of other of course,
Sure.
right? Which is what makes this exciting, difficult, but exciting. What I think is interesting though with psychedelics is what most of the current research has moved towards is not necessarily just taking it and then calling it a day, right? Which would be easier in some ways and more complicated in others. But really, it's making you more open and able to do things like accept certain therapies or to kind of go back and look at things differently
Sure.
and reassess those. I mean, if you look at most of the trials that are now coming out about psychedelics, not all of them, but the majority of them have to do with somebody takes a compound, then they receive therapy during the
Yes.
midst of being within the zone more or less, and then does that have more long lasting effects afterwards?
Sure.
So to
With
say
continued therapy or no?
so it depends on the trial, obviously. I mean, different
Interesting.
trials look at
Okay.
different dosing. They look at different numbers of times that you get dosed. They look at different, therapy. They look at different types of therapy that are
Sure.
done. So
Wow. So cool. All this stuff is so cool.
it is. It's really interesting. The what I love about it is the dispassionate looking at science and saying, is this effective or not, right? Because psychedelic treatment is very exciting. You hear it on the news and you're like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna watch that story.
Because it's
Which
taboo, by the way. Because there's a
well,
stigma, and because you feel like the stigma's breaking, and so it's exciting. I feel like.
it is. It is. I like to temper it though.
Okay.
That you have to temper it with, does it actually do what we hope it does,
Right.
right? Because if it's just a wish and a prayer that you say, oh, well, this stuff is taboo, I think that it'll help, and we want to do that, that's all well and good. But if you don't have evidence to back it up,
Sure. Sure. Of course.
it's not a good treatment,
Yeah.
right? And so that's really where the focus has been now, is to shift beyond just anecdotal evidence that, hey, I took some LSD and then suddenly like I'm feeling better, to, okay, if we manualize this in some way, can we show that consistently this is actually an effective treatment?
Right.
And that's where the art is, where the science is right this moment, is trying to figure out, is this as effective as other treatments out there, or is it all just anecdote?
Right.
Because there's definitely a desire for psychedelic compounds to
Work. Yeah.
right? Because people say,
Because it's cool and it's fun. And you
I've had
want
my
to.
own experience with it, or I've had a friend who's had an experience with it, or I saw it on TV and it sounded super cool. So everybody wants those things to work. Now it's the rubber meets the road. Does it work?
Yeah.
Right.
How's it looking so far?
So there are obviously ups and downs with it, and I think that we saw that play out a fair amount with MDMA
I was going to ask you. Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
FDA. So,
What do you think about that? What happened?
the best that we can kind of summarize it as is that there was some evidence that it worked, right, which is great. But then there were other things that were of concern whenever they were trying to get it approved.
Because you couldn't get it double blind tested.
Well, so I'll
Because
come. I'll come back to that. 'Cause that's the one that I think is the most looming problem with this moving forward.
Yeah. How are you going to give a placebo pill for a psychedelic compound?
There were some things that were specific, though. Like, for example, there was some suspicion that perhaps people were, in the subjective notes saying that it was more effective than it really was. There was at least one account where there was allegations of some sexual abuse, which
On MDMA.
right,
Okay.
which raises the problem. In that one, I think that if I was going to boil it down to the two biggest ones that were informative for groups moving forward, one was reliance on therapists is always going to be a little bit subjective, right?
Hmm.
So if you have to do therapy in the midst of it, um, You both have to rely on the therapist not to do bad things, which you would hope most people don't do.
Yeah.
But sometimes that, blows my
Especially
mind.
MDMA, especially because MDMA is the love drug, right?
Right. Blows my mind, but it does happen.
That's crazy, by the way.
The other thing, though, is if that's part of the assessment process, it's hard to overcome some of that subjectivity, right? The therapist says that the person's doing better. Do you actually have like scales and things to back that up, or is there some suggestibility there? So that's one problem. That I think is overcomable, based upon if you do enough testing, if you do enough scales, you
Sure.
do it at different intervals. I've seen different ways that it takes place. Some drug companies are starting to now try to use they're trying to use where you just take the medication. You don't have to have a therapist involved in it,
Oh, interesting.
which is of course comes with its own problems
Yeah, which
because
is there's no guidance.
right, there's no guidance. So that's
I
one
can
way
tell you
around
from
it.
experience that that it's good for guidance. It's good to have guidance.
But the one that I think is the tougher one that is very difficult to overcome is the placebo effect,
Yeah.
right? Because if you give somebody a psychedelic substance versus you give them a sugar pill, for the most part, people were gonna know the difference.
Yeah, so how important is that? If you're getting really, really strong results,
Yeah.
how important is it that like someone takes a sugar pill and is like, "Oh, I'm not tripping," like
Yeah, it depends on just how much of a risk benefit that comes out of it, right? So, like, for example, if there's a lot of risks, you want a really good placebo control trial, right? To be able to say that the benefits of this far outweigh the risks
are
that
there
you're
a
going
lot of
through.
risks?
That's one of the things that's being studied right now. Like,
Well, right now the risk seems to be that potential sexual,
well, I
but
think
that's
that's
it.
well, I wouldn't say that's it.
Okay, sorry,
I
no, that's
definitely
me.
would.
That's me saying that, not you.
No,
Sorry,
no, no. I would definitely
yeah.
say that's not it. I mean, obviously, all of the different drugs will have things that are being explored. So, is it going to affect, cardiac,
Oh, interesting.
have cardiac effects? Is it going to have blood pressure effects? Does it
Does it?
impact anything with thyroid stuff? That's what we're waiting to see. You
How
know.
long do you wait to see? How long of a window do you give that? Like someone takes it, do you give them a year? Do you give them 6 months? Do you give
Well,
them?
I mean, what we do is we see the results of the studies, right? So it wouldn't just be on an individual level or anything like that. We're going to have to see what these studies come out to. You
Mhm.
know, I definitely wouldn't extrapolate like, oh, these are the patients that I've seen in clinical trials, and here's what the side effects they had, so that must be what it is. There's a reason that you have lots of different sites
Sure,
and you
you need
collect a
that.
lot of good data, so that then you can be able to say, hey, this was just a blip that happened, in this particular clinic versus is this something that we're consistently seeing across clinics? That's what's going to come out during that whole regulatory process
Mhm.
where something tries to get approved by the FDA. That's why they do these things,
Yeah,
right? Is so that they can definitively say, this is a major risk factor for this, or this is something that we're seeing pretty consistently that you have to educate patients on if we're going to move forward with this. Because, a treatment is wonderful, but if it ends up causing such an untoward side effect that a third of patients can't stand it, it's a questionable medication at that point.
are there other medications on the market that are available that have that side effect?
Not really. No, most of those don't get approved, right?
Right.
Because I mean, if they have such profound side effects, that's one of the things that
But
the
aren't a
FDA looks for.
big chunk of the FDA's, and maybe this is me spewing back things that aren't true, but I heard that like 20 to 25% of FDA of the products FDA approves are redacted or withdrawn on maybe an annual basis. Like whatever they're like 25% of what's approved within like a couple of years gets brought back in.
I don't know. I don't know what the statistic is on that. Not something
But that
that's.
sounds really hot.
It does. It does. Although, is that because it was a bad medication, or is that because
Is
it
it because it's the trials, on a huge
on a
scale?
huge scale,
Yeah,
right? I mean, if you're doing things with a couple thousand patients, that's great, but then you suddenly start using it and a million
millions.
Americans
Yeah.
start using it, or
That's so interesting, right?
right?
So it doesn't necessarily scream neglect. It just screams that you had X amount of test group, and then when you mass apply it, there's going to be just other variables that we didn't take into consideration.
I think this is funny because this almost brings us right back to something that
Yes,
we said earlier, which is this whole blame game, right?
yes.
So do you say like, oh, well, you did wrong because now we know that there's a side effect, or was it that once it came out, there was a really good monitoring process
How
in place
charitable are we going to be?
to pick it out. Right? How charitable are you going to be with this whole blame game kind of thing? Because I would say that in some circumstances, at least, there's a really good monitoring in place, and because of that monitoring, you picked it up and you pull it off the market.
Yeah.
Great, the system worked.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah.
We would love
It
to
could
have.
be a victory. It could be a victory lap.
You could. Now, that's not to say that that's all of them. Sometimes,
Sure.
is there a medication that's brought to market and they knew about some side effect that wasn't, disclosed or something like that? I'm sure that happens. Just by law of average, it's got to happen
Yeah.
at some point. Um, but is that automatically the answer?
I'd be hesitant to tell you
I would
that.
hope it's not.
Yeah.
That would actually be that'd be a pretty profound problem in medicine if that was the answer most of the time. I would actually say that a lot of that is probably just that people end up when more people take the medication, you get more data,
Yeah.
and then suddenly that changes the picture.
I really hope that's the case.
Yeah.
I really hope that's the case. So are you encouraged? Are you excited by this, by the psychedelic research that you've been seeing?
I am an optimistic skeptic, and
I
that's
love
how
that.
I
I just
approach
read a
this
book
person.
about that.
So my stance on this is I love us looking into new things that could work. However, I want to see the evidence.
Right.
I want to see that it works, right? And so if we get back the studies and they show that yes, this is effective, I want to know how effective it is and exactly what does that mean, right? Because, like, for example, some of the things that we've recently tried in the past, esketamine is a good example of
Yeah.
this, that's been on the market. Wonderful responses immediately. I mean, we're talking sometimes that people will just go from I'm having really bad suicidal thoughts to I've seen people treated before that are like they cleared up for the first time in
Wow.
years. The question is, how about a week from now? How about 2 weeks from now? Do they come back?
What do you
Or do
observe?
you
What
have
have you
to do
observed,
it?
especially with ketamine? Say.
It depends. It depends on the person, but a lot of times people need to continue to get the medication, right? And that's okay,
Right.
right?
That's not too different than any other medication that people take.
Exactly. But I think that we need to be realistic with what expectations are for things. Because I know that there were some folks who initially, whenever that whole esketamine came out and things, they would say, "Oh, we just have to do it 3 or 4 times and then you're done. Like you don't have to take it ever again." Well, that's not. I haven't seen that for the majority of patients.
Yeah.
So that's setting an unrealistic expectation.
Interesting.
So if what am I excited about? I'm excited about like if some of these psychedelics do get approved one of these days, um, what did they get approved for and how effective?
Yeah. I'm thinking just in terms of my own experiences. Like, I've taken LSD before, and one of the conclusions that I've reached very quickly is I don't want to do this very often. Like it's a very deep and profound and intense experience, and it's not smoking a J. It's not having a beer with a couple of friends. This is intensive. And if it's gonna be a case where you find out that it works and it works for a month and you got to come back and and take another dose. I don't even know that would necessarily like. I don't know that people would necessarily even want that very frequently. I mean, it's very heavy. It's very intensive. And so that's a really good. That's a really interesting point. But that means that we're hypothetically potentially years out because you just have to see how long that window of how well they are goes.
I mean, it's always a cautious approach to releasing something to the market, right? And so I don't know how long it'll be. I think that it was important that MDMA was submitted to the FDA. Everybody likes to focus on the fact that it was not approved.
Is it a no or is it a no for now?
Everything's
It's not like a never again.
no. No,
When
because
something's rejected like that, does it really hinder it from?
well, what you need is you need more evidence, right? You can't just go back with the exact same evidence
I
again and
see.
say like, oh,
So you
here
need
you
more
go,
time to
like
do more
keep
trials.
trying, keep
Yeah.
trying, keep trying. No. But if there's new information and new data that's added, then something can get approved years later. It's just adding to that data to be able to show a convincing story that it's effective and not too terribly bad on the side effects. So if they're able to add that, can it come back up again? Of course it can.
Yeah.
I think it's just impressive that they submitted it, right?
I think it's awesome.
And a lot of folks do focus on many of the problems with it getting rejected, but I think that it has been encouraging that whoever does it next, they're not the first one,
Yeah.
right? And that does lower the barrier a little
Sure.
bit. Now, are they going to hopefully learn from some of the things that got MDMA rejected in this first round? I hope so,
Hmm.
because some of those things are things that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
But is it going to lower the entry point where people say, you know what, I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to submit it. We've got good data, all these sorts of things, and they may have failed, but at least we open the doors a little bit. I think that there is an aspect of that.
Yeah, I heard people talk, and we'll wrap up with this, I guess, because I really appreciate all this time. We're just over 2 hours. I've heard that one of the things that people are trying that people are trying to observe is it like to try to remove the tripping component from the medicine, right? So to
Yeah.
take psilocybin, but without having the altered state of mind or perceptions. What do you think about that?
So, I mean, that's always the goal, right? I mean,
You don't want you think it the
well,
goal?
let me
Sorry.
temper that. Let me temper that.
Sorry.
Um, it's always the goal to try to minimize whatever the extra effect is, but keep the core of what you want out of
Gotcha.
it, right? So,
Yeah.
for example, ketamine was one where, obviously, whenever they're treating people for depression, if you'll notice, those doses are much, much lower than those for the analgesic effect, for the pain effect.
Mhm.
So you don't really want the pain effect. You don't want them to feel numb,
Yeah.
but you want that effect. The problem with psychedelics, though, is, and your reaction to that is exactly where I was going with it, which is that part of it, right?
Yeah.
Like
I don't know.
if you miss out on some of that altered perception, is that going to make it ineffective? And that's one of the reasons that they do these dose dependent studies. So, is 1 milligram okay? Is 30 milligrams
Hmm.
okay? What's the threshold, right?
Yeah.
Because it's always trying to get to that point where how effective can you be minimizing the side effects? And in this way, the side effects might be you go on a trip for an extended period. Where's the balance? What's
Is the
the
trip
dose?
considered a side effect?
It's a good question. Like,
Right?
and that's a good question that hasn't been answered yet. I mean, how much of the trip is necessary in order to receive the treatment and to get better? Um, that's what studies are doing. Just looking at that.
Very excited. You have to let me know when you get to when things are published. You'll come back and do this again.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're going to see more and more of this. I mean, there's a lot of different medications that are currently being looked at for this in that space. So I think that we're going to see more data over the next couple of years. And
I'm very excited
I
about
think
it.
we're all going to see what it looks like.
I'm very excited. You have high hopes for it,
Uh,
or you're again optimistic and skeptical.
let's say optimistic and skeptical because I have high hopes for any new treatments, new cutting edge things. But high hopes doesn't translate into it's going to work.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm waiting to see, just like everybody else.
Doctor, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of
This is so
course.
much. This is so much fun. Thank you so much.
Yep.
All right, take care.